Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jeffrey Cookson, and my pronouns are he, him. I am wearing a mic'd headset and reading glasses. I have kind of a blueberry colored dress shirt on that's open at the collar. I'm joining the call today from my home in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which does sit atop land historically stewarded by the Ocheta-Midwakaton tribes. So I do particularly want to call out the Midwakaton Sioux tribe for their continued stewardship of much of the land in the Twin Cities area. I'm a coach and facilitator here at LCW. And while I am a subject matter expert in a few specific cultural groups, really the 30 plus year span of my career in the D&I space has been around helping people more effectively navigate whatever differences they're in proximity to that are important for them to navigate. And so in today's context, it's around gender identity and sexual orientation and the LGBTQ plus population. I will also share with you that I did begin my consulting career in what is now called the I have to get the name correctly for you because the name has changed over time. In the Center for Queer and Trans, the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life at the University of Minnesota, which is the current version of the name. And 30 plus years ago, I started as a professional academic in that office. And happy to be joining you here today. I am a member of the LGBTQ plus community. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Rebecca, to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We are really excited to talk about the language of the LGBTQ plus community, and in particular focus on gender identity. Jeffrey and I really our goal is to, for you all and people then that you talk to after this can feel more knowledgeable and confident and brave when dialoguing around this topic, whether you have a family member in this community, a colleague, friends, or even don't know anybody in this community. Just to quickly introduce myself, I am Rebecca Parrilla. I grew up in Puerto Rico. My pronouns are she, her. And I am the Director of Content and Research here at LCW. I have been in the cultural competence and DEI consulting world since 2006. For those of you who cannot see me, I'm wearing a green short sleeve blouse. I am 52 years old. I'm wearing black glasses because I'm old and I cannot see very well. I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community, and I also happen to have a kid who is non-binary, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. But we wanted to kick off with a quick poll, just to get a quick glance at what your goal is today in attending today's session. So if you could just take a few seconds to answer this poll, it would be very useful for us. Thank you so much for voting. I see a lot of quick votes going on here. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to end it now, just for time. And it looks like most of you here are for your own self-development, which is amazing. And I know it's not just you, because I know you're going to be sharing this knowledge and paying it forward. We have a little over a half of you to support your colleagues, and then about a quarter of you around interest on bringing this to your organization. So thank you so much for that. All right, so let's set the current context around this community by way of a few headlines. So, throughout the past, I would say about 10 years or so, there's been kind of accelerated and more acceptance and codifying of rights for LGBTQ plus people in the US and around the world. And one interesting statistic that I saw is that 1 in 5 Generation Zers, and by the way, people in Gen Z tend to be those born on or after about 1997. So 1 in 5 Gen Zers in the US now identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans, which is a percentage that's nearly doubled in only 5 years. So, there's been advancement, and still 68 countries still criminalize being gay as of 2022. These countries are located in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. 13 countries criminalize their citizens for being transgender or for gender expression. And here in the US, there's recently been, I'm sure many of you have noticed, a backlash or backtracking of support for trans people. There was a Pew survey in 2022 that, and you see here, this particular headline refers to that survey, that although almost 2/3 of respondents in that survey favor laws to protect trans people in jobs, in housing, in public spaces, 38%, so almost 40% of people feel that society has, quote, gone too far in accepting trans people. And almost half of Americans support making it illegal for medical professionals to provide health care to support gender transition for kids. And 41% favor requiring trans people to use public bathrooms that match the sex that they were assigned at birth. So this is just meant for you all to kind of take it in and look at what's been happening lately through the lens of the LGBTQ experience. So we're going to start the conversation about the trans identity. I'm going to hand it off to Jeffrey, but before I do, I wanted to encourage and invite everybody to comment and ask questions on the chat throughout. So when one of us is presenting, the other person will keep their eye on the chat. We want to definitely address as many of those as possible. Jeffrey?
Thanks, Rebecca. So we're going to talk about a number of terms on our conversation today. So to start us off with that, I just want to gauge your familiarity with 5 particular terms. So I'm going to launch a new poll and ask you to vote in this poll for which term do you think applies to each of the statements that are in this poll. So there's 5 statements, and then pick the term that you think most aligns with that statement. We'll give you a few moments to complete that. And it looks like some votes are starting to come in now, so we'll give you a moment to finish up that poll.
Little did you know that you all would be getting a quiz today.
We're going to make you work for it.
I also want to underline what Jeffrey said in the chat. You can feel free to ask Jeffrey or I a question privately if you feel more comfortable, just through the chat.
And I'm going to go ahead and end this poll now and share the results, so you can see how you answered in comparison to your peers. And then I'm just going to very quickly give you what the correct answer is. And we'll talk about each of these terms as we go through the program. And we will also provide you in a follow-up, a glossary of all of the terms that we have brought up today. And we'll continue to put links into the chat to the things that we reference as we go through the program. So number 1, the correct answer is sexual orientation. Number 2, the correct answer is sex assigned at birth. Number 3, the correct answer is gender expression. Number 4, the correct answer is gender identity. And number 5, the correct answer is non-binary. And so we realize that if you're not a part of the LGBTQ plus community, you might be less familiar with these words. You might have had a different experience around your socialization and just might not be as used to using these words in your everyday conversations. But we would encourage you to use words, particularly if they are unfamiliar or uncomfortable to you, and to practice them. Those of you who joined the call in the moment or two before heard Rebecca make a comment about the way in which I pronounce her last name, which I've done because I've practiced it over and over and over again. And so sometimes we just need to use words and just practice saying those words out loud, which can have the impact of increasing our comfort with those words. So having said that, I just want to talk about this journey that really all of us go through. Let me stop sharing this poll and get it off the screen here. This journey that all of us go through. We all go through a journey around socialization, around our gender identity and sexual orientation. For many of us, our journey is kind of what is the normative journey for most people. And then members of the LGBTQ plus population have a journey that is different from what is the normative experience that most people have. But we all have this journey, and the journey starts with the sex that we're assigned at birth. And this is uh, a most commonly asked question of expecting parents is, are you going to have a boy or a girl? And people will ask that. Family members, friends, even strangers might ask that. But we often don't reflect on, well, why is it that we ask that? Why do we wonder what will be the gender or sex of this child? And the reason that we do that is because we're socialized to do that. We're socialized to think of people in terms of this binary construct of male or female, either one or the other. And many of us don't know about the concept of trans or non-binary genders or know anyone who might be trans or non-binary, although lately more and more people are feeling accepted enough to speak out about that. There's more things that are talked about in popular culture, in the media, in the video streaming services that you might utilize. And so we have this sex that's assigned at birth, and it's usually based on an exterior examination of anatomy by whoever the birth professional is in that moment. So literally kind of like, congratulations, it's a boy, based on an external examination. So that's the really the first marker in our journey is the sex that gets labeled for us. And then there is gender identity and gender expression. So typically the terms sex and gender are often incorrectly used interchangeably, though they have very different definitions. So our gender identity is the a person's innermost concept of self as male or female or a blend of both of those or neither of those. It's how individuals perceive themselves and what they identify with and call themselves. And gender identity is different from sex. Sex refers to biological attributes like um, reproductive anatomy, chromosomes, hormones, so on and so forth. And while many of us have been led to believe there's only two sexes, either male or female, there are people born every day on planet Earth that have the biological components of both male and female, either reproductive anatomy or chromosomes or hormone levels, so on and so forth. So it isn't as cut and dry, perhaps, as we've necessarily been led ourselves to believe. And so on this journey, for some of us, our sex assigned at birth matches what our gender identity is, that innermost conception that we have about ourselves. And when that's the case, the language to ascribe to that identity or feeling or circumstance is being cisgender. And for some of us, our sex assigned at birth doesn't match our gender identity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And so gender expression is the external appearance of one's gender identity. So usually we express this sometimes very consciously, sometimes unconsciously through behavior, through clothes, through mannerisms, through appearance, or perhaps even through vocal expression. And gender expression is not always linked to the gender that we have. So think about the outward expression you prefer for your gender identity, whatever that is, and how our culture has influenced how you perceive of yourself around this identity. And so we all have this journey that continues on to sexual orientation, which is a physical or emotional or romantic attraction to other people. Not everyone has a physical, emotional, or romantic attraction to other people, but when we do, that's characterized as our sexual orientation. So what we want to do is spend just a couple of minutes now and look at this term transgender, which is an umbrella term. So there are lots of identities that can fall under transgender. And as we chat about this, I also want to share with you that, our language is evolving, language changes, and we all don't use the same language. So two people might have the very same, two members of the LGBTQ plus community might have the very same identity, but use different language to describe that identity. And then two people also, to add to the richness and complexity, two people might have different identities but use the same term to describe that identity. And so really it's very much a personal, it's a personal component. And so tracking and paying attention to the individual LGBTQ plus people that you know and what language and words do they use. So to visualize this, we have this umbrella, and we mentioned that sex assigned at birth doesn't necessarily always match our gender identity. So if my internal conviction of being, the the messages that I take in from how I'm socialized around gender, if that doesn't match this sex assigned at birth label that's been ascribed to me, then those folks are transgender. And under the transgender identity umbrella is also the concept of being non-binary. And so folks who are non-binary, their sense of personhood does not align with this either or dichotomous thinking of male and female. And so on the left, you see some binary transgender folks, just examples of some famous folks. So folks who have transitioned in their expression, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And then on the right hand side, you have some folks who identify as non-binary. Now, there are some non-binary folks who don't really like the fact that the transgender umbrella applies to them. Maybe we'll see the evolution of language of that evolve somehow in the future. When we're non-binary, it's a gender identity that reflects people who exist between or beyond that man-woman binary dichotomy. And so it could be a person that identifies as neither male nor female, or as both male and female. Like one of Rebecca's children, who Rebecca will talk about in a little bit. So non-binary is a very wide term. Some people use it interchangeably with additional terms like gender queer or gender fluid or gender performing or gender diverse or gender expansive. And then when folks transition, so if a person is transgender and their internal conviction of being doesn't match the sex assigned at birth, they might go through a process of transition. And so this is a process that can involve many components, not all of which will be gone through by everyone. So it can involve transitioning in social circumstances, it can involve transitioning in legal circumstances, it can involve transitioning in medical circumstances. So someone goes, a process that someone goes through to affirm their gender identity. So it could mean changing hairstyles or changing clothing or other forms of gender expression. It could mean changing names or pronouns. It could mean changing identity on legal documentations. It could mean gender affirming medical care, such as taking puberty blockers or hormones or having gender affirming surgeries. There isn't any one way to transition, and many people choose not to or are unable to transition for a wide variety of reasons, both within and beyond their control. And then one thing I think it's important to keep in mind is, particularly in the case of folks on the left-hand side of that slide who are binary in their construct of gender and transition, it's important to remember that they're not transitioning their gender from one gender to another. What they're transitioning is the presentation of that gender. So that person has probably had that internal conviction of being from their tinyhood. From a very young age, has known this about themselves. And so when someone transitions socially, they're not transitioning from this gender to that gender. They're transitioning the presentation of the gender that has always existed underneath and inside of them, but for a variety of reasons have not chosen or been able to express that gender previously. So a man isn't becoming a woman. That woman's been a woman underneath the masking of maleness all along. And then another term we want to introduce to you here that you may be familiar with, the term is dead name or dead naming, and this usually pertains to people who have changed their name usually to better reflect their true gender. And dead naming is an act of using a trans person's former name, usually their birth name. And a name change for some people is part of kind of taking control and celebrating their anatomy. And dead naming someone can feel hurtful or disrespectful and like a refusal to accept that person for who they are. So using someone's name is absolutely necessary. And we know these terms might be unfamiliar to some of you, but we want to bring these into our daily use to create a culture of belonging so that each individual person knows their identity best. And if someone chooses to share with you what their gender identity is, it's likely because um, for some reason they have a level of trust, and hopefully you'll be able to receive that vulnerability with some level of acceptance. And so we want to continue on and talk about a word that maybe has a little bit of controversy around it as well, which is queer. And so just acknowledging the complexity around this word. And in order to do that, I want to launch another poll for you. Thank you, Rebecca. Just gauging kind of what is your perception of the word queer. And so we'll give you a moment to answer that. And then I see, Rebecca, thank you. I see you've been responding to a lot of things in the chat. So I appreciate you taking care of that. We'll just give another moment for folks to finish that, and then we'll share the results of that. And I'm going to go ahead and end that and share the results. And so it looks like the biggest vote is positive now, but negative before. So perhaps folks who voted in that way might have done some reflecting around the way in which they perhaps have experienced the word queer in their history and how it's been applied, and maybe coming to a new understanding of the way the term is being used now. So I do appreciate sharing that. Again, the reminder that language is dynamic. Language is not constant. There are words in the dictionary today that were not in the dictionary 10 years ago. There are words we used to use at work on an everyday basis that we no longer use today. So we know language is fluid and dynamic and alive and continuing to change. And the word queer can be a loaded term. I'm going to stop sharing this poll for you and bring it off the screen. So we know queer can be a loaded term and have a lot of context. It used to be a slur, a word that brought on hate and sometimes fed into violence. And in the late 80s, it began to be reclaimed and is now widely used by many people in the LGBTQ plus community to describe themselves in their community. 30 years ago, when I was at that Center for Queer and Trans Life at the University of Minnesota, the undergraduate students at that time, so 18, 19, 20-year-olds, renamed their student organization the Queer Student Cultural Center. That was 30 plus years ago. Those folks are now pushing 50. So perhaps there's a generational component around the comfort as well. The term is also more and more considered to be inclusive of the entire community, including people with more fluid identities, whether that's referring to a fluidity in their gender identity or in their sexual orientation. Some people within the community dislike the term, especially people from older generations who perhaps suffered more of the brunt when that term was a slur. And due to its varying meanings, we recommend that you use, if you're not a member of the LGBTQ plus population, that you use this word only when either self-identifying or quoting an individual who self-identifies as queer. My cousin identifies as queer, for example. Unless, of course, you've been told by the people that you are communicating with that it's okay if you, as a person who's not a member of the LGBTQ plus community, use that term. There are countless LGBTQ plus centers and organizations that now have queer in their name. Sometimes queer stands for questioning as well in some of these organizational contexts. And if someone lets you know that they don't like the word queer. They don't like it used to apply to people or to themselves, or that they don't like really any word, right, even outside of the context of our conversation to describe them, then go ahead and skip using that word to describe that person. But we want to share just a little bit more on this term queer and the history of the term queer, because it's been used by LGBTQ plus people as a self-identification term for much longer than most of us actually realize. And so Rebecca has shared on screen a letter, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So in 1895, so 100 plus years ago, the trial of Irish poet and playwright Oscar Wilde. During that trial, there was a letter from the Marquis of Queensberry communicating his displeasure with Wilde's relationship with his son. And that letter was read aloud in court. And in that letter, the Marquis refers to Wilde and other homosexual men at the time as snob queers. And it's believed that the slur queer originated around this time. American newspapers picked up on Queensberry's use of the word queer and adopted it. In 1914, queer appeared as a derogatory slur more and more commonly in society. And then in 1934, in this letter that's on screen, which is held at the National Archives in the UK, and it was discovered following a raid connected with a place called the Caravan Club. And writing to Billy, the club owner, this person, Cyril, uses queer to describe his sexuality. So he's using queer as a form of self-identification, even as long ago as 1934. And other documents obtained in similar raids across London further demonstrate the use of the word queer as a self-identifier in the community. And then a few years later, in 1937, the concise New Partridge Dictionary of Slang lists queer as an adjective that means one, homosexual, derogatory from the outside, not from within. So no, even in this definition from the 1930s, not from within. So despite the term's own history as a slur, many individuals have claimed the word queer for themselves, finding it an appropriate label for self-identification. And the dictionary also goes on to say that the noun queer can also refer to a homosexual man or lesbian, usually a pejorative, but also a male homosexual term of self-reference within the gay underground subculture, as it was thought of. So as long as queer has been a slur, it has also been used by LGBT people as a self-identifying marker. I want to talk just very quickly and mention a little bit about use of the word homosexual. So just know that many members of the LGBTQ community don't appreciate or like the word homosexual being applied to them. A lot of that has to do with the origin of the word being a derogatory. The original definition of homosexual was a mental disorder. So many members of the LGBT community don't appreciate that term. I've used it in the context because I'm quoting from a dictionary, but I would tend to avoid that term. So we want to talk just a little bit more about this journey and how we form our sense of gender and gender identity. I'll turn it back over to Rebecca for that.
Thank you. Isn't that cool? I thought this was so cool when we discovered how long this term has been used and that letter from 1934. I thought that was the coolest thing. And then Jennifer, to reply to your chat, yeah, that sounds like a good starting place. There are, of course, nuances if you're not a member of the community, but you are, have very close relationships with people who are. So it also, goes around that. So I just wanted to answer that. So how do we form ideas of gender and identity in our upbringing? And for that, I wanted to ask you just to give some thoughts about these three images that you see here. So let's start with the first image on the left. When you look at that image, what do you think it's meant to convey? What comes to mind? What is this image saying to us, just in general? Go ahead and share in the chat. Binary cliche. Stereotypes, gender binary, man and woman. We hear a lot gender roles. So gender roles, society stereotypes, same thing, right? So gender roles is one of the things that has fed into the historical oppression of people in this community, the norms around these gender roles. And so we've seen that there have been some morphing, some expansion around gender norms for, in particular, cisgender women in the US and around the world, starting with the women's lib movement in the 60s and 70s. But there's still persistent stereotypes that harm people in the queer community in different ways. So, for example, a trans woman who chooses to wear clothing that isn't, super feminine could be seen as not woman enough or invalidated in some way because she doesn't conform to certain feminine expectations or stereotypical female expectations. So even within the LGBTQ community, people can still use gender stereotypes to judge, to question, to invalidate people. And I just want to show you a quick example here. So Alok Menon, they are a non-binary author, poet, designer, and speaker. And they've been quoted as saying that historically, gender non-conforming trans feminine people are only permitted to exist on a screen, in a photograph, on a stage, right, as art. And so their work and message is deeply rooted in actually creating day-to-day, just regular environments for trans and gender non-conforming people to thrive. So I'm just going to play a quick video here for you so that you can get to know them.
At a fundamental level, people still think that you have to be a man or a woman and that you have to look like what society dictates as masculine or feminine in order to be real and worthy and successful. And so much of what I'm trying to do with my poetry and with my self-portraiture is to show people it is possible to live a gender non-conforming life. We're here in Central Park, where I've been spending so much more time now that it's finally warm. It's important to be here and to claim public space. For the trans community, and especially for those of us who are gender nonconforming, we can't even exist in public without being afraid of being attacked. So often people are like, look, if your community's experiencing so much violence, why are you focusing on art? The reason I'm an artist is because we have to create the images of the world that we want. It's really important to understand that when you're a young person who's trans, you don't have control of your body because society, the medical establishment, your school is gatekeeping you constantly. So style really became the only place that I could begin the process of self-recognition. Fashion is powerful. I can walk around in public. If I'm wearing pants, they can say nothing. If I'm wearing a dress, everyone will stare. So I began to see fashion as an extension of my politics. So if I'm just at the diner, wow, we're having a pride march. If I'm just like walking down the street, we're having a pride march. If I'm going to the gym, we're having a pride march. Every time I try to go shopping in a mainstream store, I walk in and it's men's clothes and women's clothes. And I'm like, well, where are the clothes for me? And then I'm in the dressing room and people are like, what are you doing here? So I said, I've had enough of this. I'm gonna start designing my own clothes. And then it became something more powerful. So I wanted to share some of the photos that I recently put out as part of my third fashion collection. I wanted to name each article of clothing after a term that's being used to police trans and gender nonconforming people. I wanted my fashion to sort of interrupt that idea that I'm becoming something I'm not. I'm creating a canon that doesn't exist, and that when people see these images, they can create new possibilities for themselves.
So Alec actually puts themselves out there online in real life and live performance and their existence as their authentic self. And so, as you can imagine, that opens them up to be a target of endless insults, hate speech, and violence. Let's move on to the next image here. Remember these three. So if you look at the second image, what comes to mind? What we're driving at here, forced to choose, right, is cisnormativity. So this is a word that maybe many of us are not familiar with. Cisnormativity is the belief that being cisgender, which again is when your gender matches the sex that was assigned to you at birth, is superior, and that being transgender is either unnatural or abnormal. And so one consequence of cisnormativity is that a lot of aspects of life for transgender people that are are challenging, from access to routine healthcare, hate crimes, discrimination for jobs, just general erasure through history. Now, that said, in the last few years, there's actually been a shift, even though there's a backlash right now, but there has been a shift in trans and gender nonconforming visibility and inclusion in society. For example, airlines have added a undisclosed or other option to ticket purchases. A lot of venues have changed their restrooms to be available for people of any gender. I'm sure you all have seen examples of that. Beauty and fashion spaces have degendered a lot of their products. And MasterCard, they offer what this was in the headline slide, a true name feature for trans people to use their chosen name. Also for US passports. So as of this year, there's a new gender marker available for US passports. And Jeffrey and I have a friend and colleague by the name of Ada. They are non-binary. And when they heard about this news, they told us about it. And by the way, applicants are not required to submit any medical documentation, even if their selected gender differs from any other citizenship or identity document. So that's fantastic. At any rate, Ada provided this feedback. They said, when they found out about this, I quickly rode a roller coaster of thoughts and emotions around this news, from elated to terrified, optimistic to doomsday. It's a big decision to choose this passport. As someone who travels frequently to places that are not very LGBTQ friendly, handing over a passport to an authority in a country where it could be stigmatized or illegal is a huge consideration. Should I affirm my identity and potentially jeopardize my safety? So this is a decision that genderqueer people have to make all the time. As difficult as the options are for me, I'm so grateful, right? So as a cisgender person myself, my reaction to the news about the passport was, that's awesome. And I didn't immediately think about the potential consequences as Ada, describes here. So moving to the third image here, what thoughts come up for you about the third image? Sophie's got it, heteronormativity, right? And so what does that mean? It's the belief that is superior, right? Heteronormativity is superior. It's the implicit belief that other sexualities are unnatural or abnormal. So I've actually had people ask me, not so much recently, when I was in a relationship, hey, who's the man and who's the woman in your relationship? I'm a lesbian, by the way. And that reinforces heterosexual norms, that those kinds of dynamics, gender roles are required of all relationships, regardless of our sexual orientation. And by the way, that's a common microaggression. So let's try not to ask that question. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with showing a photo or depicting men and women in relationships and in families, but when it's the only way that we can imagine a family or any sort of relationship as the only normal way, then that is what we want to get away from, right? That there are many different ways of having a family and relationship. So those persistent gender roles, stereotypes, cisnormativity, heteronormativity, those are the root of how we judge each other and ourselves, even if we're conscious about these things. So not assuming that someone will follow a certain normative path is one really, really important way of being an ally and being LGBTQ inclusive. So we're going to turn towards the non-binary experience now, and Jeffrey's going to lead us through that.
Thanks, Rebecca. So Rebecca and I are both cisgender. Neither of us are non-binary people. So we wanted to make sure that we included some non-binary first-person voices in our program. So we're going to play a brief video for you. I'll post a link to an article in the chat for you. And as we watch the video, maybe look for what themes might stand out to you. So let's go ahead and have a listen to this video.
There's a whole variety of experiences that people have that cause them to question, like, hey, maybe I don't actually fit into the definition of, man or woman, and that there's something else.
I identified as male before. I didn't really ever feel comfortable fitting into the masculine or male environments or just seeing myself as a man.
I've always had questions as a child. I always would put on my mother's makeup and her lipstick.
I identified quite a while before I came out to people.
I started identifying as non-binary when I was 17. I just knew that calling myself a woman and calling myself a girl did not feel accurate and did not feel good and did not feel like a home to me at that time in my life anymore. Most people are going to assume that you're one of two genders, a man or a woman, and so every single day you have to be correcting them and you have to be declaring that you're non-binary to pretty much every new person that you meet.
I remember a few times I went on job interviews and I dressed like how I am. And I did very, very well in the first interview. And they're like, oh, you did so well. Just when you come next time, can you dress like a boy? It's especially challenging in dating.
No one really knows how to deal with you and whether they're allowed to be attracted to you, really. I think people's knowledge of this is definitely getting a lot better with time.
We're becoming more relatable. People are seeing us for who we are. And so I think that brings about this general air of acceptance.
I think the future of gender identity, hopefully, is one where we don't force the binary on everybody.
I think the future of gender identity is so much more colorful and wide and different and varied as we think it even can be.
I hope that the future will move towards more of individual expression rather than this mob mentality to follow the crowd to be like everybody else.
I definitely wish that we can all just pass through this phase of trying to categorize people and just take them as what they are.
Being able to reclaim our narratives, I think that's the next step, is that trans voices are the ones speaking for trans people and non-binary voices become the ones speaking for non-binary people.
So one of the themes that I hear in this video is that the non-binary experience is very nuanced and is unique to each individual person, and this need to express one's internal conviction of being. And Rebecca, I'll turn it back over to you because I know maybe you want to just share a few things from your lens as a parent.
Yeah, so just really quickly, just to share a personal story. So this is a picture that was taken just last Saturday. We all just ran a 5K, but Maddie is my younger kid in the middle. And Maddie, they have demonstrated expansive gender expression since they were literally 2 years old. And, you know, they do not identify as their sex assigned at birth. Maddie is now 10, by the way. And as their parent, we gave them the option throughout the years of being any gender they felt like they were, including trans, but kept hearing, no, mama, I'm not that, I'm not that. But in the end, you know, they have been consistent throughout their lives that they are both a boy and a girl. And at one point a few years ago, when they learned about these pronouns, they and them, I will never forget, their face just lit up. I saw the smile, I saw the kind of weight lifted off, and it was like, that's me. And that's what me and their other parent have been calling them probably for the last 3 years or so. So I just wanted to share that quick story with y'all, and I'll give it back to Jeffrey.
Thanks, Rebecca. I appreciate you sharing that. And so this next slide will just give us some examples of non-binary identities that have been around for centuries. And I'll post a couple of links in the chat for you here. So Out and Equal is a workplace advocacy organization, is a US-based organization shared in their non-binary identities history report that companies around the world are focusing more and more on building non-binary inclusion into their programming, their culture, and their policies. And while the shift focuses towards visibility and inclusion is a relatively new development, non-binary people are not new and are not a trend and are not a Western identity or influence. Genders outside the binary have existed throughout human history, and non-binary people enjoy a rich, diverse history around the world. And here we see on screen representation of non-binary identities of people in Mexico, in Canada, in South Africa, in India, in Hawaii, and in Indonesia, most of whom have had longstanding recognition in their respective cultures. And so that doesn't mean, though, that that recognition doesn't come without a level of stigma. And so I'll highlight for you in the bottom left, the image is of a Bisu priest who is Poang Mateo Saidi, and they are from a precinct. Precinct isn't the right word. A province. That's the word I'm looking for. They're from a province in Indonesia, Sulawesi, which has a history of having 5 distinct genders recognized for over 6 centuries. And so in the language, the native language in this province, there is a word for that corresponds to the English language concept of cisgender men. There's a different word that corresponds to cisgender women. There's another word that corresponds to transgender women, another word that corresponds to transgender men, and an additional 5th gender that identifies all aspects of gender combined in one person to form a whole. That's the Bisu term, which is also reserved for people who have a spiritual leadership presence within the society. So almost an honored position within the society. And this existed pre-Islam's introduction into Indonesia. But again, that doesn't mean that the population and people who identify with these 3 additional genders that most of us are less familiar with, that doesn't mean it doesn't come with some level of stigma. So just want the reminder that this is not like a Western concept, and non-binary people have existed probably for the entire time that humanity has existed. So let's talk a little bit more about the pronouns and the use of pronouns, and I'll turn it back over to Rebecca for that.
This is another great video. Let's play this video to introduce pronouns.
Oh my God, okay.
Do I have to do it with that one?
What a pro.
I don't even...
Pronouns are basically words used to refer to a person rather than their name.
They, she, and he are all examples of common pronouns.
He and she are gendered pronouns.
She's typically used by people who identify as female, and he's typically used by people who identify as male.
However, he or she pronouns are sometimes used by people who don't identify as strictly male or female.
Some people prefer gender-neutral pronouns.
Gender-neutral pronouns are generally used by people who identify as genderqueer or non-binary.
A few common gender-neutral pronouns are they, ze, and a, but there are a whole array of gender-neutral pronouns.
People think long and hard about the pronouns they'd like to use and why.
If you use the wrong pronoun for someone, that's what's called misgendering.
When a person has new pronouns, it can take a bit of getting used to, but it's really important to use the right ones.
A person's identity is very important, and it's super important to respect that.
So when people use the wrong pronoun to me, I find that I've gone through all this effort to kind of come out and be myself, and it's kind of just thrown back in my face. Coming out for me was mainly awkward with a lot of people that used to know me. People didn't understand. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding. When people get my pronouns right, it makes me feel like I'm, you know, like being myself, and people are responding to that and are just like respecting me as a person.
When people get my pronouns right, I feel respected by them, and I end up feeling a lot more comfortable around them.
Sometimes if you identify someone with a different pronoun that they don't identify as, you can potentially actually upset them. And I don't think you should be upsetting someone in this process. And that's why I think it's very important to know what someone identified themselves as and respect it.
It's not about like you're a terrible person if you mess up, or you're a terrible person if you take time to adjust. You're totally not. But it's more about making that extra effort for someone that you do care about, or just kind of being a bit considerate that everyone has different needs, and you know, it's just a really cool thing to do for a person.
All right, so let's talk about pronouns. So of course, language matters, and we all know it kind of helps create the environment that we want to live and work in. And so we want to encourage you to use people's correct names, obviously, use gender neutral words as much as possible when referring to groups of people. For example, instead of saying you guys or ladies and gentlemen, maybe trying to practice saying folks or everyone or people, and then of course use people's correct pronouns. And so one of the simplest and most concrete ways that we can show that we are, that LGBTQ people are safe being around, is by just normalizing sharing your pronouns. So making space for it is just as important as asking people for their name. So when you introduce yourself maybe to a new colleague, you can say, hi, I'm Rebecca, my pronouns are she, her. Welcome to the team, right? And please notice I'm not saying my preferred pronouns, I'm saying my pronouns. And so it's definitely okay if somebody chooses not to state their pronouns, that's totally fine. The point is including pronouns in your introduction makes it okay for everybody to do so, and especially for people who have different pronouns than you might be used to. So you could also add the pronouns to your email signature, to LinkedIn. You know, we can make it so that's not only people in the trans community who need to put themselves out there. And you know, what I'm about to say is not an overstatement. Using the language that people share with you can affect their health outcomes. It can affect their feelings of belonging, their feelings of safety, and an opportunity to not only survive, but thrive in a world that's filled with messages of hate, messages of othering. So just like when we try to, you know, how Jeffrey tries to pronounce my last name correctly to show respect, using the correct pronouns does the same thing. And I just wanted to show you this really awesome tweet about some kids at McDonald's, right? So somebody tweeted, there's some school kids on the table next to us at McDonald's practicing their friends, new, they, them pronouns. If we practice now, then think how happy they'll be on Monday at school. And that hits me very close to home, having a non-binary kid, but you know, it is something that you know, doesn't cost us anything, and it just takes practice. So let's practice. Speaking of practice, you know, it's a fill in the blank exercise that we're going to do just to kind of hear how it sounds to use they and them as a singular, right? Not plural pronoun. So I'm going to do the first one. And if two of you could perhaps raise your hand just to volunteer to do the second two, it's super easy, I promise. But let me, I'm going to just do the first one. So Faye was on their way to the bus stop, but they realized they forgot their phone. So they had to run back home to get it, right? So practicing using they. So who would like to do the next one? Go ahead and unmute yourself or raise your hand.
You can take that one.
Thank you.
Yep. Meet my friend Jonah. They introduced me to rock climbing, and now I climb with them twice a week. When I can't make it to the gym, they climb by themselves on the boulder walls.
Thank you. Yeah. And so themselves is a little bit more accurate because it's interesting, right? Because when you normally talk in the plural, themselves is what is correct grammatically. And yet when we're talking about one person, themself is a little bit more accurate. Thank you so much, Andrew. Who would like to do the next one?
I can do the next one.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Jamal started a new job before their first meeting with the team. They opened their Zoom account and updated their pronouns so folks could use the right ones for them.
Exactly. Thank you so much to both of you. So, you know, this is not easy to do, but it takes practice. Also, people who go by multiple pronouns are out there, right? So the conversation surrounding pronouns is deeply personal, but you may know a non-binary person who uses more than one type of pronoun. In fact, one person that Jeffrey and I know, who was an intern here, they use he, him, and they, them, because while he still feels comfortable with the pronouns that were assigned at birth, male, their gender identity exists outside the gender binary, and they really don't prefer one over the other. So there, I don't know if Jeffrey has done this already, but there's a link that we want to show you that is an interview that was conducted with 10 non-binary and trans people who use more than one set of gender pronouns, if you want to read more about it. So before we go, what if we make a mistake, right? What if, for example, we call somebody by an incorrect pronoun? And this happens all the time. I mean, I have a child who I have been calling they for 3 years, and every now and then I make mistakes. So they usually happen due to forgetfulness or just not knowing, not because we're being intentionally or consciously hateful. So if you realize you made a mistake, briefly apologize and correct your pronouns right away. If you realize it later, just go to the person and say, hey, I'm really sorry I used the wrong pronouns in that meeting. I know you go by they, them, and I'll make sure I get it right the next time. Making it a big deal in the moment is not necessarily helpful. When we make a mistake, we might immediately kind of be worried that people are going to think that we're not trans friendly. But generally, it's good to avoid making it about, ourselves and our intent, and just quickly apologize and just promise to get it right in the future. Another quick tip here. So if there's a need to publicly correct pronouns or take actions in a group setting, for example, if you're a people manager or a senior leader, you could say something like what we just put here. Hey, you know what? Ada earlier mentioned that they go by they pronouns. I know for a lot of folks in this room, that it may be new or easy to forget, but it's important that we work on this and get it right for folks, right? So that's a good suggestion. So I'm going to hand it back to Jeffrey to help us close this off today.
Thanks, Rebecca. So as we look to wrap up, just some helpful tips for yourself in the last few minutes here. And we're going to launch an exit poll for you in a moment as well. And so, as Rebecca mentioned, encouraging people to introduce themselves with their pronouns by modeling that for yourself. And so just using that on a routine basis, not when you think there is the presence of trans or non-binary people, but just anytime you introduce yourself. It establishes an environment that normalizes it for people who might have pronouns that other people might perceive that their pronouns are different from them. Center discussions about workplace attire on presenting professionally compared to someone's perceived gender. So what's a appropriate dress for anyone rather than dressing more in alignment with what I think a person's gender is. Using gender neutral language, as Rebecca mentioned, is important as well. So sometimes we have to practice that and just get used to using that language on a day-to-day basis. When asking for gender demographics, if you can include non-binary, trans man, trans women as options, have all gender inclusive restrooms, if that's a possibility, so gender neutral restrooms, and track and follow LGBTQ plus organizations and voices. One way to keep up on language that any population is using is to track voices and diverse voices from within that population. So who do you follow on social media streams or streaming services or the way in which you consume information about popular culture and news and media? Track diverse voices and pay attention to diverse voices. One great organization to be aware of and follow, and I'll put a link in here for you, which has a very comprehensive glossary, is PFLAG, which is an acronym for Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. That's the original title if they were creating their organization again. Perhaps it would have more letters in it, but PFLAG is a wonderful organization that provides support to people who are gay adjacent, I guess, if you will, and they have a wonderful glossary there. I know we're at time, and so I do want to wrap up. I don't want to speak to Rebecca's calendar, but I can stick around for a few minutes, so we'll leave the call open and invite you to exit the call as you need. I want to thank you all very much for your participation. Been a lot of activity in the chat, and so I will turn it back over to Rebecca for any final closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much. We know that this is an hour of your very busy day, and we hope at least that you've learned something new that you didn't know before and that you can pay it forward. Thank you so much, and we'll be following up with an email for everybody with the recording. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.